One question I get from new chopper builders all the time is, Grease, should I buy a full bike for my chopper project, or should I just buy the parts that I need to build the chopper that I want to build? This is a question that has been floating around in the chopper ethos forever, but I have never seen another video on the topic. So today we're going to talk about why you might consider doing one versus the other, so that by the end of the video you can decide which option is right for you. I'm Grease, you're watching Grease's Garage, and I'm going to help you skip the struggle. Whether you have built multiple choppers or you are working on your very first build, there is one constant amongst all of us chopper builders, and that is that our eye tends to be drawn to the custom parts of our motorcycles. It's very easy for your eye to go straight to those custom pipes, or that aftermarket air cleaner, that tall sissy bar, or those brand new handlebars that you put on that build. But very rarely does anyone stop to think about just how many factory components are still on that custom bike that are being overshadowed by all of those custom parts. And this is the best place for us to begin our discussion today. So on my build, the one sitting behind me, my Evo Big Twin, I did not save that many of the factory parts, but I still think it's useful for you to know exactly what I did save, because the amount of things might surprise you. Starting off with the most overlooked, we've got the charging system. This would be the regulator rectifier that's mounted to the front of the bike, the stator, and the coil. At least in the beginning. I did go on to replace the coil later, but when I first considered this bike completed, I had the factory coil on there in the factory location. Other factory parts that I retained, the oil tank. I personally love the oil tanks that come on these factory models, and a comparable oil tank aftermarket would cost you $300 to $400. In addition to that, I also retained my factory front end. Big fan of the wide glide front end with the big chunky tires. I know most of the chopper community hates this look, but me and a couple other people whose builds I super admire, we are just in love with that wide glide look. Nice, low, mean looking bikes. And I did not want to get rid of that front end, so keeping that front end saved me a good bit of money. In addition to that, I also retained my factory floorboards and the foot controls and the brake lines. And last but not least, I also retained my factory title. Now, you might not expect to hear that in this section right here, but when we are comparing buying a full bike versus buying parts, the title does come into play. We won't spend too much time on that in this video, but if you're more interested in how to get a title for your current project, click on this video right here. I did a full breakdown of how to get a title for your chopper project if you didn't get one with the bike when you bought it. Now, like I said in the beginning of this section, I didn't save that many factory components on my particular build. Part of that is due to the fact that I go jockey shift on all my bikes, which means I'm removing all of those hand controls. But just for the sake of argument, you on your first build might also be retaining your front brake and front brake setup, your hand controls, everything that's going on with your levers on your bars. You, unlike me, might be retaining your factory transmission. That's another piece that you didn't have to buy separately. And in addition to that, you might also be retaining your front and rear wheels as well as your ignition system. All of these parts add up if you're buying them individually, especially if you're buying them new and not getting them at a swap meet. All of this to say, when you are comparing a full bike versus buying the parts, the first step, and it's why we're starting today's video with this as our first step, is to make a list of all of the parts that you are going to need and then add up the cost of buying those parts. So, do you love going to swap meets? Do you like wheeling and dealing and scoring and trading different parts with your buddies at swap meets or on eBay? If so, it would benefit you to remember that even though when you buy a full bike, it may come with parts that you aren't necessarily keen on keeping. What parts am I talking about? I'm thinking big, ugly stock tanks, full skirt fenders, those big black box ECM units that you're not going to be saving, tassel grips, floorboards, even though I can't imagine why you would want to take some floorboards off. All of these takeoff parts are hidden gold just sitting in this project bike that you are buying, because even though you don't want them, it doesn't mean somebody else doesn't. For example, on my bike, which you can see on the screen right here in front of you, this is a 1994 Evo Fat Boy. It came with these big ugly tanks, these big ugly tins. Here's what I did with those parts. I sold my tins for $400. That's gas tank and both fenders. I sold my ECM, the ignition control module, or whatever ECM stands for. I sold that for $120. I sold these exhaust pipes for $200. My rear wheel for $100, my seat for $50, and I traded this 5-speed transmission to a buddy of mine for the 4-speed rotary top that I have in there now. Now, I bought this bike for $3,500, and all of those parts alone are just about $1,000. So when you're looking at it that way, you're talking about buying a full bike, an Evo Big Twin, for about the price of a Sportster, around $2,500. Not a bad deal. So I use this example, which again is just anecdotal. It's just my experience. It doesn't mean it's going to go exactly the same for you, but I use this example to remind you that the cost you're looking at when you're talking about buying a full bike is not really the end cost. There's a lot of hidden gold in that bike that's still waiting to come back into your pocket. Now, before you get to thinking that this whole video is just going to be me bashing the idea of starting with parts instead of a full bike, let's talk about a situation where it probably does benefit you to start with parts, and that is the aftermarket frames. The reason for this is because if you are planning on buying an aftermarket frame, which you could be for any variety of reasons up into including maybe you just don't want to weld it, or you want to sell that frame with that title, whatever the reason may be. If you're buying an aftermarket frame, you are looking at shelling out over $1,000 for that frame. So once you start looking at that cost, it starts to tip the scales in favor of going the parts route. And the reason it might benefit you to then go the parts route is because everything else you're going to add to that aftermarket frame, a stock component probably wouldn't have worked for you anyways. For example, your stock gas tank probably doesn't just bolt right up to your aftermarket frame. Neither does your oil tank, neither does your fender, your sissy bar, your regulator rectifier. There is a whole list of parts that you are going to have to custom mount, and probably at that point, you would just want to buy aftermarket parts, because if you're going to change the whole geometry of the frame by buying aftermarket, you might as well customize the rest of it. So, for those of you that are looking to go the aftermarket frame route, really do your homework in that first section we talked about. Add up the cost of those parts, because there is a very good chance that if you're going this route, the parts option is actually going to be the better and more cost-effective option for you. All right, for my first-time builders, if you are watching this video, which I certainly hope that you are because most of my channel is geared toward first-time builders, there is a lot that you are going to learn in your first build about what you like and what you don't like on a chopper. And in your future builds, you will end up having a sort of preference roadmap for what parts you want to keep and what parts you don't. And having this self-informed roadmap to your next build is one of the situations under which you might find it easier to work from parts as opposed to working from a full bike. But on the flip side of that discussion, when this is your very first build, the biggest challenge and the biggest hurdle in front of you is just getting that thing to the finish line. Sure, maybe your foot controls are still stock, maybe your coil is still in the stock location, and maybe all of your controls on the bars are still the factory clamshells, but when you are riding down the road on a bike that you built, none of that stuff is going to matter. You just need to get that first build over the finish line, and from there, your options will expand. But for you first-time builders, having a full bike to start with and sort of paring that down to a streamlined motorcycle, which we would then call a chopper, that is the easier and more efficient option. And there's really no shame in that option. Me personally, I've built all of my bikes from full bikes. I have never bought just the motor and the trans and plopped it into a frame. But that's because there's a lot of things I like about these factory components. Like I mentioned earlier, I like the floorboards, I like the stock controls, and I like having that title open and clear the minute I start my projects. So it's not to say that one option is better than the other or that more advanced people do this while first-time builders do that. It's just to say that when you're new and you don't know where you're going, it's easier to have more of the factory bike available to you so that if you find you're not able to tackle a certain job that an aftermarket frame would have required you to do, you're able to just use what the factory gave you for the time being, and later on, you can make it cooler when you're ready. Now, a lot of today's discussion was centered around whether you're going with a hardtail on a stock frame or a full aftermarket frame. But what if you don't know which one of those options is right for you? Well, good news. This video right here is your natural next step. I break down the full discussion of why you might choose one versus the other in a very similar fashion to the way we just did today's video. So if you're struggling with that question, click on this video right here, and I will catch you guys next week.